Okay, now that we're ready to add more structure to our game, it's important to talk about Unreal's gameplay framework. We want to work within the systems that they have built for us so that it all connects really nicely. So I have this reference guide open. You can see the URL up here. Maybe it changes in the future, but essentially it breaks down the difference between a lot of their different major classes inside of their framework. So you've heard me talk about pawns and characters before, but there's a whole lot of other things. And we're going to talk about the game mode and how that connects with a lot of other things. So you can see a little diagram down here. You can see a general overview, but I want to show you my plan for the next couple of videos and what we are going to implement for ourselves. So first of all, the big thing that we have is our game mode, right? You could imagine this as an object that gets spawned in our scene. And on our game mode, we have a couple of important things that we want to do in most of our level types. We may want to reload the level, for example, like when it's a game over or a win or a retry or whatever. We may want to respawn the player. And you could think of a respawn as just instantly go back to the checkpoint, not reloading the whole level. We'll talk about the difference between that in a little bit. And finally, we want to be able to win. And there might be other things in a larger game, but I think this is a good starting point. So when we implement these things, we're going to put it in the game mode so that we can keep things organized. The next thing we're going to talk about is the player controller, which we've already sort of dealt with. So let's label this. This is another object that gets spawned in our scene. We made a custom one. We made our custom game mode and our custom player controller. And on our player controller, usually we like to do things that are independent of the pawn that we're controlling. So you might think if my ball didn't exist, things that I still might want to do, for example, I'm going to do respawning and reloading on a button press. That might be something, or later on like a menu or a pause or something. But I'm going to do inputs for tab and backspace. Those are the buttons that we're going to use. And just to make this really clear, I'm going to start drawing some arrows over here. So let's say that when our player controller detects that we press tab, we want to tell the game mode to respawn. When we press backspace, we're also going to communicate with the game mode, and we're going to tell it to reload. That's going to be reopening the map. Again, we'll talk about the differences later. We also talked about having our pawn that exists inside the scene. So we'll draw a little ball down here. And inside of our framework, our player controller is responsible for possessing the pawn. So I'm going to draw a little line here, possess. Okay, so the ball can exist inside the scene and it may not be possessed, but we can also just take control over it and start controlling it. That's what makes it a pawn rather than a normal actor. Another thing we are going to experiment with is something called the player state. Now, traditionally, you could put a lot of the player information on the player controller or the pawn if you want, but if we want to do this the proper way, we probably shouldn't, because the player controller should mainly just be responsible for input and managing cameras and that kind of thing. If we're just talking about data like collectibles or lives or spawn position or whatever it is, we probably want to hold on to that on a separate object. And for our game, this is going to be called the player state. We'll make a custom one. And specifically on the player state, we're going to hold on to the spawn point. So at any point in time, if the game mode wants to spawn a new ball pawn, just like it does in start, then it is also going to need to know what the spawn point is. So I'm drawing these arrows to indicate some kind of dependency or connection that we're going to need later on. So the game mode is going to need to request the spawn point from the player state and use that in order to spawn the pawn. So let's actually spawn down here. And when we spawn it, it's also going to possess it with the player controller. Another thing that we may end up using, I'm actually not sure yet, is going to be something called the game instance. Draw another little thing over here. We will call this the game instance. And the game instance is going to be something that travels in between multiple levels, and anything that needs to exist between scenes, you might want to consider using the game instance. The most common example for this is something like music. So if we ever wanted to change the music track and we wanted that to keep playing between multiple levels, like the main menu or something, then we would need to communicate with the game instance and tell it to change its music. Now, this arrow could come from anywhere really, but let's draw it from the bottom just to say from anything, and can tell it to play music. And then we could send it a new track or something. Now, in addition to all of this, like this is our core setup, we're going to have a lot of different kinds of actors inside the scene that are going to be doing various things like bouncing the player or whatever. The few ones that we're going to mess with, one is going to be the kill volume. So I'm just going to draw a little red cube here. And for this cube, at some point, the player is going to enter the cube and it's going to tell our pawn to kill. The pawn's going to die in its own way. We might think of death animations or sound effects or whatever. But in addition to that, once the pawn has done its kill functionality, it's going to tell the game mode that it needs to respawn. Like once it's done dying and we lock the controls for a little bit of time, we need to tell the game mode to handle its respawn and it'll spawn a new one at a spawn point or whatever. Another thing we might want, I'm going to do a win volume. So there's lots of ways to handle winning inside of your games. Like you could say if you collect a number of things or you defeat the boss or whatever. Just to keep things really simple, I'm trying to show you the simplest possible game type that uses all these systems. We're just going to do a volume where when the player enters it, they win. Now, in this case, if the player enters the volume, we may not need to do anything with the player. You know, if they had like a victory pose or something, we could tell the player to win. But for now, I'm just going to have the win volume communicate with the game mode and tell it to win. And then potentially our game mode up here could tell the game instance to play the music. So I actually like that better. So I know this is a lot of crisscrossing arrows, but I think it's important to at least try to start mapping out how your game system will work. The main point being that each of the different systems inside of our gameplay framework in Unreal is responsible for very specific things. Our game mode is going to handle all of our major game functionality, like what controls the overall flow of the game. And especially if it's the same type of things between multiple different levels, we probably want to put that on the game mode. Our player stage is going to hold on to any player specific information that is, outside of the pawn and that the player controller shouldn't need to track. Our player controller is mainly just responsible for handling all the input and possessing a pawn and managing the cameras for that. And sometimes communicating with the game mode. If there are additional actions that need to happen, like respawning or reloading, if the ball was dead, we would still want to be able to reload the level, for example. Our pawn is everything specific to the thing that we are controlling. Our game instance is something that travels in between scenes, most commonly for music or any kind of like loading or save load systems. And then we just have lots of actors in our scene that do various things like volumes or, bounce pads or teleporters or whatever else. And those are going to communicate with whatever they need to. So all of these major components are represented inside the gameplay framework. And anytime you're building a new piece of functionality, you really should stop and consider, where does this belong? Because if we start building too many exceptions and weird edge case scenarios, our system's going to get very confusing. I just want to give you one example on how we can connect all this stuff. This is really my plan for the next couple of videos. Things may change slightly, but as long as we come into it with a plan, I think we'll be fine.